We're in a section of Matthew, the first section that I've entitled Come and Worship. And really, Jesus is not doing a whole lot himself. And that's why I've entitled it that way, because it's showing really, Matthew, I believe, under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, is showing who Jesus is. He's kind of developing the person of Jesus before we see in the rest of the book of Matthew what he does, right? And so this whole first section, really chapters 1 through 4, just a short section, is all about coming to Jesus, simply seeing who he is, and worshiping him there. The next section then is Watch and Learn, where Jesus spends a lot of time teaching and instructing his disciples how to serve. And the final section I've entitled Follow and Go, from the last section on, where he begins to instruct on his death, and ultimately he dies and raises from the dead. Spoiler alert if you didn't know that part, okay? So that's kind of where we are, and so that means the question we're asking a lot of the text is, who is Jesus? And that is similar to what we will be doing today in Matthew chapter 2. We, as Americans, experience leadership change quite often. Every 4 to 8 years, we experience, not a new regime, that's probably the wrong word, but a new leader come into the White House and the old leader leave the White House. And inevitably, we all have the same reactions happen every single time. As the old president leaves, 50% of the people say, wow, that was the worst president in American history. And 50% say that was the best president in American history. And then as the new president comes into the White House and is inaugurated, 50% of the people say this is going to be the best president in American history. And 50% of the people say this is the worst president in American history. This is just kind of a testament to how divided we are right now. But there is leadership change that happens very often in our country. And as this leadership happens, as this transition happens, it often ruffles feathers. And that's what we're talking about when that disagreements. But I think leadership change affects us not just in the president, but in a lot of areas of our life. Okay, maybe you get a new boss. The boss has come into work to try and speed things up a little bit, make you more efficient. And you're like, things were just fine before you got here. Thank you very much. Okay, maybe ruffles from some feathers. Maybe a new teacher is trying to get the grades better in your class, and so they're more strict and they're more stringent on what you're supposed to do. Maybe a new coach is trying to change the way your team plays, or maybe a new pastor just shows up and he just likes to do weird things. He's just a total weirdo, okay? Leadership changes often ruffle feathers. And I think they ruffle feathers because a lot of us live in our own little kingdoms, right? We basically walk around in our lives with crowns on our heads and saying, this is my kingdom, this is my life, this is my thing, and this is how I'm going to act, and this is how the rest of you are going to submit and serve to me. A lot of us view ourselves as kings of our own little kingdoms. And so when a different leader comes in or something that challenges our authority comes in, our feathers tend to be ruffled. Well, really, I believe that's not too different than what we see in our text today. We see here Jesus enter into the scene and the various reactions people have to him entering their own little kingdoms. So the question I want us to ask today, as we think of Jesus being king, is what does this text tell us about Jesus as king, as the majesty over everything? And then how does this majesty of the Messiah affect our little personal kingdoms? So the question is, what does this text tell us about Jesus the king? And how does the majesty of the Messiah affect our own little kingdoms? This account begins in verse number 1 by telling us that God leads wise men to find and worship Jesus. And that's where we'll pick up after we spend a moment in prayer. Pray with me, please. Lord, we thank you now for this opportunity to come before you and to hear your word. Lord, I thank you for the blessed privilege of preaching the gospel. And I pray that now you would help our focus, get rid of distractions. Lord, I pray that you would use me and fill me with your Spirit, empty me of the things that I want to say this morning, and instead help your word to be clear, to be abundant. Lord, I pray that you would make us obedient people. Help us to be people who in our kingdoms know who the King is. Lord, we love you. Again, we are begging for your help. We pray this all in your Son's name. Amen. So this big account begins by telling us that God leads the wise men to find and worship Jesus. This worship really comes in a suspenseful setting. Look at verse number 1. It says, "Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king." When we think of Bethlehem, we ought to think of one person in particular, and that is David. Bethlehem is called the city of David. It is where he was from. It is his royal city. And so this ties us instantly from verse number 1 of chapter 2 back into chapter 1, where we saw Jesus come from the line of David. And now being born in Bethlehem, it reinforces that fact that Jesus is really the greater David. Jesus comes from the line of David and is born in the city of David. The setting also includes the time. It was while Herod was the ruler, the king of Israel. Now, Herod's position was unique in that it was Roman appointed. At this point, Rome had kind of done their thing and taken over, and Israel was a province inside of Rome. And so the Caesar at the time set this guy up, Herod, to be in charge of this area of Judea. This is the southern portion of the nation of Israel. He was not the rightful king of Israel. He was the appointed king of Israel. He was not the person that Israel would have chosen to be in charge. And yet, as we read history, he is actually still called King of the Jews, not just King of Israel, but specifically King of the Jews, though he himself was not a Jew. He was actually an Edomite who was just put in charge of the Jews. His reign was not great. His rule over the nation of Israel was not something to be mirrored. He was unliked by the people, which makes sense when you're being ruled by someone who you don't want to rule over you. He loved being in charge, and he hated the thought of people taking his throne away from him. He was a very vindictive, cruel leader. In fact, if you read some of the history books, there's a story about him that when he was getting ready to die, because he hated the thought of anyone taking his throne, and then because he hated the thought of people celebrating his death, he actually planned for the execution of key leaders of the Jewish people so that people could not celebrate when he died. The plan was, when I die, you kill those key leaders so everyone is mourning with me and not celebrating the fact that I've died. That's the type of leader this was. And so right in verse number 1, you can kind of feel the political tension of two kingdoms beginning to clash in the world. Jesus, the son of David, born in the city of David at a time when a not rightful king ruled in Jerusalem. This worship came at a suspenseful time, but it also came from unexpected people in verses 1 and 2. It says at the end of verse number 1 that, "Behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem." As we look at the wise men, it's pretty popular for us to have them at the manger scene when we do our, I guess it's just a manger scene, nativity scene, okay? They weren't there. They weren't at the manger. They came a little while later. And we have all of these pictures of who the wise men were in our minds, but really, we don't know much about them, okay? We don't know who they were. Really, they're called wise men. The Greek word is translated magi in other places. And really, the translation of the word to wise men shows we don't know exactly who they were. Some people think they were magicians. Some people think that they were astrologers, which is really just, it talks about the stars, but really it's just superstition. Maybe they were astronomers because they were watching the stars. We don't really know who they were. It's very likely that they weren't even necessarily God-fearing people, because if they were magicians or astrologers, they were doing things forsaken in the Old Testament. So we don't know who they were, really. We also don't really know where they were. Notice it says they were wise men that came from the east. Well, I don't know if you've looked at a map, but there's a lot of things east of Israel. They could have been from a number of places, and so we don't really know who they were. What this cues us into, though, is the fact that they were Gentiles. This means that they were not the people you would expect to come and worship the Jewish king. In fact, this fits with Matthew's broader theme of the fact that Jesus came to be king over everything, not just king over Israel. This is seen in the fact that these Gentiles come to worship him. They didn't even know exactly where they were looking. And this is fascinating to me. We don't know who they were. We don't really know where they came from. They didn't even know where they were looking. Could you imagine that with me? Like you're coming from hundreds of miles away, and you're on your camels, and you start to get to Israel, and you look over to the guy who's the guide and say, okay, where are we going? He was like, oh, I don't know. All right, what do you mean? What do you mean you don't know? We just traveled all this way. I'm sore from sitting. I've got camel sores. Like what do you mean you don't know? Well, I don't know. I'm just kind of following that star up there, seeing what happens. They didn't even really know they were going. How do we know that? Look at verse 2. They came to Jerusalem and they said, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" They just went to where they knew the king would be. Probably they went to Jerusalem and they started asking questions. They said, "Where is he that is born the King of the Jews?" Now this phrase is important, born King of the Jews, because it shows that this person was the true rightful king. It really is a contrast, not he that is appointed King of the Jews, he that is born King of the Jews. That's the way God planned for Israel to be reigned over, was by passing down from father to son to rule the people. And so they are looking for the person who was born King of the Jews. So we don't know who they were. We don't know really where they came from. They didn't know they were looking, and we don't know how they got there. Verse 2 simply just says, "For we have seen his star in the east." And this star, we really don't know much about. Many commentaries think that the Magi, the wise men, knew about a prophecy from Numbers 24:17. Talking about a star coming out of Judah. And I think that's totally plausible, because if you remember, in Israel's history, they were actually exiled for 70 years in Babylon. And if you read the book of Daniel is all about this coming Messiah, this rock that was going to knock down all these other kingdoms. And so these wise men, if they were in the east and they had heard from the Jewish people, they would be expecting some great king to come do great things. And maybe while Daniel was just verbally talking about these prophecies, he was like, oh yeah, there's this one in Numbers about a star. And these astronomers were like, ooh, a star? I love stars, okay. Tell me more. And so when this star showed up, they decided to follow it to find the king. But we don't actually know what star it is. Many people throughout history have tried to go back and figure out what star and be able to pinpoint the date. And that's probably a fine effort, but it's not really the point. I think this star is simply miraculous. I think this star was a star put here by God to draw the wise men, the Gentiles, to come worship Jesus. This miracle is not a problem, right? Last week we talked about the virgin birth. At the end of the book talks about the resurrection of Jesus, so it's not really hard for me to believe that God put a star to guide people to worship Jesus. Not only that, this wouldn't be the first time he led people with light. If you remember the story of Exodus, where the Israelites are leaving Egypt, what was one way that he led them? Via a pillar of light. And so God leads these people with this star, though we don't really know anything about the star. God is leading these people. So we don't know who they were. We don't know how they got there. They didn't know where they were looking. There's a lot of things we don't know, but there is one thing we do know for sure about these wise men in the end of verse number 2. It says, "And we are come to worship him." So with everything we don't know, we do know one very important thing, that these men were come to worship Jesus. This word worship means to express in attitude or gesture one's complete dependence on or submission to an authority figure. Now, this is not necessarily religious. This word is used to talk about worship or obeisance showed to a king, bowing down to a king and stuff like that, just politically. So it's not necessarily religious, though I think it could be when you look at the reaction when they finally get to Jesus. But at the very least, it is submission to a king that is not automatically theirs, because there is something special about him. They are at the very least submitting to a king that of a nation they don't belong to, because there's something special about this person. Jesus was special enough that these Gentile wise men were led by God to come and worship him. This worship then receives a really troubling response. In verse number 3, we see Herod was literally troubled. He says, Herod the king had heard all these things. He was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. He was unsettled. We've already talked about this. The guy loved being king. He loved being in charge. And so to have the opportunity to lose that because there's a new king in town would be frightening. It's interesting that it says all Jerusalem is troubled with him, and we don't have time to discuss Jerusalem's reaction to the king, Israel's reaction. But I think this is probably because of his vindictive nature. Maybe you've heard the phrase, when mama ain't happy, ain't no one happy, okay? When you got a cruel king and he's unhappy and he's troubled, well, you can bet everyone else is going to be a little bit troubled and worried. Herod is not only troubled, but Herod knows exactly what's happening. Look at verse number 4. When he had gathered all the chief priests and the scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. He goes directly to the religious leaders, these priests and scribes, to ask where the Messiah should be born. He has no question. This is fascinating to me. He has no question who they're talking about. He knows they're talking about the Christ, and yet this troubles him instead of encourages him. I believe we begin to see where his loyalties lie when it comes to God's plan for the world. Then Herod has his knowledge confirmed in verses 5 and 6. They said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus is it written by the prophet, and thou Bethlehem in the land of Judah art not least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor, and he shall rule my people Israel. The religious leaders come to Herod, and they quote the Old Testament explicitly where he would be born. Herod responded with anxiety. Really, I feel like these religious leaders kind of respond in apathy. They just kind of like say it. And it tells us very important things. It tells us he's born in Bethlehem. We've talked about that. But it also tells us who he is. He is a governor. For out of thee shall come a governor. This is a participle, which means they're describing Jesus based on what he does, which is to lead, to rule. This word is used by Jesus to talk about the chief of people. So like this is your boss's boss. The Messiah, born in Bethlehem, was not some like middle manager person. He's the CEO. Right? He is the governor of the people. And it also tells us what he does. He rules God's people. Now the quotation from Micah 5:2, the Hebrew word, means to have dominion or reign. This Greek word means to shepherd. It means to shepherd. So actually, I think this strengthens the concept of Jesus' Davidic nature as king. If you remember, David was a shepherd. And so there's this beautiful picture here of Jesus shepherding the people of Israel the same way David did. In 1 Chronicles chapter 1, it says, thou shalt feed my people Israel, talking to David, and shall be a ruler over my people. And so Jesus shows up as the leader to lead his people. And this confirms all of Herod's suspicions. It confirms all of his worries, and it probably had him shaking in his sandals. So he gets to work in verse number 7. He inquires. It says, Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. Remember that for later. That's an important detail. He privately pulls them away. Then he directs them in verse number 8. It says he sent them to Bethlehem. Go and search diligently for the young child. Really, I love this. Okay, when we step back and we think about it. Herod loved being king. Herod, if you've read the rest of the story, does some bad stuff. Herod, who does not care for Jesus, sends people to worship him. Isn't it funny how God works sometimes? God can use some of the most difficult, frustrating people, some of the most difficult, frustrating circumstances to bring worship and praise to himself. That's what happens here. He directs them to go worship Jesus. Then he instructs them. Look at the end of verse number 8. He says, bring me word again that I may come and worship him. Notice he uses the same phrase in verse number 3. He wants to come and worship. He is purporting himself to be have the same desire to be the same people that they are. So this worship is something that Herod has a crazy response to, a troubled response to. And then this worship really we see is worthy of royalty in verses 9 through 11 as the wise men come to worship him. We see they follow the star again in verse number 1. They heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them until it came and stood over where the young child was. This is part of what makes me think the star is a miracle. Right? They showed up, they came back out from the king, and there was the star again, and it was like moving to the direction it was supposed to be to guide them. So they followed the star, and then it says they rejoiced in verse number 10. When they saw the star, they rejoiced in exceeding great joy. Now, this joy is not just like, oh, yay, we did it. It's exceeding great. Okay, so think about that for a moment. The joy they're feeling is like maybe think of your wedding day. how exciting and joyful that was. Maybe think of the birth of your first child, or any of your children, I guess. They're all joyful experiences. Maybe think of, I think I talked about your wedding, talked about the birth of your child, maybe graduation, maybe a promotion. Just like this joy, that's how they felt when they found this child. Then, not only did they rejoice, they worshiped. Verse 11. When they came into the house, they saw the young child and Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped. Notice who they worshipped. They worshipped him. Didn't worship the parents. They didn't worship Mary. They didn't worship Joseph. But they worshipped him. They worshipped Jesus. They fell physically and subjected themselves to the small child. Then they gave them gifts. Verse 11b. When they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We know what gold is. It's the expensive yellow shiny element. Frankincense was something that Egyptians used for embalming. Often it's from a tree in Arabia or India. Myrrh was a perfume also used for burial. And a lot of commentaries, as they talk about this section, going all the way back to like Origin, like way, way, way a long time ago, they see each of these gifts representing a part of who Jesus is. So the gold, he's the king. The frankincense, he's deity. And the myrrh, he's going to die and rise from the dead. What's really important here is not the fact of what the gifts are, but it's the fact that the gifts were given. That's what's important here. The fact that the wise men came and gave gifts is important because giving gifts was something you did when you visited a king. Really, it is a confirmation of who Jesus was as the true king. When the Queen of Sheba in 2 Chronicles chapter 9 comes to visit Solomon, she comes with lavish gifts for Solomon. So these gifts show that Jesus truly is the king of everything. This worship then ends in retreat, in verse number 12. Being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed to their own country another way. So we just spent this first section. We want to ask the question, what does this tell us about Jesus as king? Well, I think it tells us that Jesus receives worship fit for a king. It shows us that he receives the worship that is fit for a king. The worship of this wise men required great effort, traveling from a great distance. It required submissive spirits, bowing down to a child. And it required costly gifts, sacrificing all expenses. You don't worship something that you don't think deserves it. You don't worship something that you don't think is important. Now, this whole section to me just kind of boggles my mind a little bit. And I'll tell you why. I love my kids. They're like some of my favorite people. They're one of God's greatest gifts to me outside of salvation and marriage. But other people's kids? Like I was a youth pastor, but like, come on. For me, for these wise men to see the star because they found a kid and to rejoice exceedingly. I mean, I might clap for a kid at his birthday, but I'm not going to like jump off the walls about it, okay? And then for them to come to this child, 2 years or younger, and to bow down and like submissively worship. Are you kidding me? I can't possibly imagine that. But it shows how special Jesus was. Jesus was worthy of receiving this worship because he is the true king. And I think many of us want to see ourselves in the wise men. We want to see ourselves as the people that worship Jesus at all costs. And yet, I'd probably say that most of our worship shows we don't think Jesus is much of a king at all. Often our worship shows that we don't really think he's the king of our life, but instead that we are king of our lives. Often we can't be bothered to set apart time for personal devotions, yet alone travel hundreds of miles to go see King Jesus. We can't be bothered to actually submissively practice what we hear, let alone bow down at the crib of a child. We don't give Jesus often the best of what we have, but we simply scrape the barrel and give him what's left over. Our worship often does not match the worship of the wise men. But no, Jesus is the king that deserves the worship worthy of a king. Does your worship show that Jesus is your king? Is it submissive? Is it sacrificial? Is it taking great effort? He deserves the worship of a king. The account continues by depicting Herod's rejection of Jesus as a threat to his throne in verses 13 through 18. We see first that Herod's rejection is warned about in verse 13. When they departed, that's the wise men, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise and take the young child and his mother and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. So the angel warns about it. He tells him where to go to Egypt. He tells him how long to go until I come back. And I think that, until I come and get thee. And I think that was probably a big encouragement for Joseph. Because you got to think, Joseph started this whole story in Nazareth, if you think of Luke chapter 2. And then an angel came and said, hey, go to Bethlehem. And now he's in Bethlehem, and the angel says, hey, go to Egypt. And at some point, it's like, do I need like a TripAdvisor or trip insurance? Like, I'm moving around so much. Like, where's my Mileage Plus plan or something like that, okay? And so to hear this encouragement of hey, you stay there until I come and get you, probably was a big encouragement for Joseph. So he tells him how long to go, and he tells him why to go at the end of the verse. Until I bring thee word, because Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. You see, Herod's hand, his plan is now being shown. Herod has a plan to destroy Jesus because he feels threatened by his authority. Herod's rejection is warned about. Herod's rejection is also ultimately avoided by Joseph's obedience. Look at verse 14. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt. There's so much good truth about Joseph's reaction here. His obedience is immediate. We don't see any questions. We don't see any argument. We don't see any hemming and hawing. He just gets up, gets the fam, and goes. His obedience is wise. He leaves at night. He doesn't make a big deal about the fact he's leaving. He gets out and secretly goes. His obedience is complete. He makes it all the way to Egypt as God has commanded. Joseph's obedience here we also see fulfills prophecy. Look at verse 15. And he was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt I have called my son. Now, we need to pause here for just a moment and understand fulfillment and how prophecy works. Normally, when we hear the word fulfill, we think of the literal exact fulfillment, and it does often mean that. We saw it meant that when it came to being born of a virgin. There was a prophecy in Isaiah to the house of David, and that a virgin would be born, and lo and behold, the Messiah would be born of a virgin. Lo and behold, years later, the Messiah is born of a virgin. We saw that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem in this chapter. Well, lo and behold, the Messiah was born in Bethlehem. That is often what it means in the Bible. However, the word fulfill doesn't just talk about that. The word itself actually means filling up, or like something fitting a certain circumstance. So when Matthew uses the word fulfill, he is not always talking about prediction, but he is talking about precedent, or he is talking about a pattern. And so when he says fulfill, he is showing how Jesus fulfills certain aspects of who Israel was, how he relates to the history of Israel, showing him as the true king of Israel. He shows how he fits different situations. Let me give you an example of this word fulfill, not meaning like a literal perfect prediction, but a literal precedent fitting. And that's in chapter 3, verse 17. 3 verse 15. Jesus answered and said unto him, this is at his baptism, Suffer it be so now, for thus it becometh us to fulfill all righteousness. So he's not talking about the fact that he's fulfilling some prediction, but that he is filling up, fitting all righteousness by being baptized. He is fitting a pattern. And that's how this is used here as well. And this is important because the Bible cannot mean what the Bible does not say. And the Bible cannot mean what the author did not say. And so when we look at this prophecy in Hosea, we need to understand its context and how that could fit, okay? Put your thinking caps on. I know we're getting a little deep, but this is important for how we read the Bible, okay? So this prophecy here in verse number 15 comes from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. This context is of Israel's failure to be faithful of God. The book of Hosea is a book about Israel's unfaithfulness and yet God's faithfulness to them. The book of Hosea, it starts with a picture of Israel's unfaithfulness by Hosea marrying his wife Gomer, who becomes a prostitute. She leaves him, and he goes back to show God's faithfulness, and goes back and he buys her back from being a prostitute. Okay? That's the picture of Israel being Gomer, leaving God, and yet God being faithful enough to come back and buy Israel back. And yet, God being faithful judges Israel. And that's the context of this in Hebrews chapter 11, in Hosea chapter 11. At the end of Hosea chapter 10, God had promised judgment. There was judgment and trouble coming. And now, Hosea, trying to be hopeful and speaking hopeful words from God, says this. When he's looking at the hard things that are coming from God, he finds hope because when Israel was a child, verse number 15, Hosea 11, chapter 1, when Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. So in this time of judgment, he is looking to Israel's past, and he is saying, look, God loved Israel and saved them from Egypt. He delivered them from judgment in the past, and I'm hopeful that he will do it again. And so he's finding hope in this situation. Hosea did not have Jesus in mind when he wrote this. This is not his authorial intent. And so the Bible cannot mean what it does not say. So he's not saying, hey, in the future, God loved Israel and he called Israel out of Egypt. So how does this work? Jesus fulfills this prophecy in that he fits the pattern. This is the precedent that was set. So like this, in the same way Hosea looked to God delivering Israel as a source of hope for the nation, so Jesus, coming out of Egypt, presents hope for the nation. In the same way God previously gave hope for Israel by drawing them out of Egypt, he is now providing hope for Israel by bringing the Messiah out of Israel. So let me give an illustration, and if this didn't make any sense, I'm sorry, I got nothing else. Okay, I think of it this way. A lot of times when I think of pattern versus prediction, I think of a way that a child and a parent interact, okay? And so if a parent is a smoker or is a drinker or goes off the rails, a lot of time kids follow, right? Barring spiritual intervention. A lot of times the way that a parent goes is the way that a child goes. In a lot of ways. So if a parent is tall genetically, a lot of times the children are tall genetically. If the parent loves sports, a lot of times the children love sports. Now, that's not a prediction. You don't say when you have a kid, oh, this kid is going to be a D1 athlete, but it's fitting the pattern of who the parents were. And that's kind of what's happening here. Jesus is fitting the pattern of how God has worked in the past in bringing people out of Egypt, in bringing hope for his people. Okay, we could talk about that for a long time, but we're already running out of time. Okay, so that's how this is fulfilled here. Jesus fits the pattern of how God has worked in the past, bringing hope out of Egypt. Herod's rejection is a murderous attempt to save his throne. It's avoided by the obedience of Jesus, but then his rejection ultimately is this murderous attempt to save his throne. Look at verse 16. Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, was exceedingly wroth. So this murder comes out of anger. He felt mocked. He also murders out of knowledge. He sent forth, in verse 16, and slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. You remember that part from earlier, where he had inquired of the wise men? That was important for them. It was important to note, because that's how he knew who to kill. So he murders knowledgeably. This makes me think that this was always part of his plan. That as part of his plan was to annihilate Jesus. This murder also fulfills prophecy in the same way that the last one did. If you look in verse number 17, then was fulfilled that which was spoken of by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, in Ramah there was a voice heard, and lamentation, and weeping, and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they are not. This here from Jeremiah is not a prophecy, but it's actually recording a historical event. In Ramah, that's where they would round up all the men and they would ship them off to Babylon. And all of the men that got shipped off to Babylon would leave these women behind who would cry and weep and sorrow. And so that's what's happening here. He's saying in the same way, in a general kind of hope, something bad happened. This is where Jesus is found. And so he murders to fulfill prophecy. I would also say that he murders as a precedent. You know, this isn't the first time people try to kill Jesus. In fact, the second time people try to kill Jesus, it's not an attempt, but they succeed. He sets a precedent with Jesus being the king and people seeking his life. This tells us that Jesus as king is rejected because of his threat to human authority. Jesus is rejected because of his threat to human authority. Herod and all the people's reaction to the Messiah was simply anxiety, it was angry, and it was attacking. Why? Because Jesus had done something? Jesus is 2 years and older. He hasn't done anything yet, but he has a threat to their personal autonomy and authority. And so they reject him. Herod really is like the oldest child in a group of siblings. He's in charge. And when the siblings start to move around and do something he doesn't like, he responds with whatever it takes for him to get his way. And so while we often like to associate with the wise men, we often don't associate with Herod here. But I'm afraid that more often than not, we find ourselves rejecting Jesus and his commands in our life because of the threat it has to our authority. We hear the commands that Jesus brings and get anxious about what it means for us. We hear the commands of King Jesus and get angry because of what it will require of us. We hear the commands of Jesus and maybe we attack others because of the way it makes us feel. I think we see that in the world all around us. Jesus as king is a threat to human authority, both appointed and personal. This account resolves briefly here with God leading Joseph back to Israel after Herod dies. Look at verse number 19. When Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appears in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. So the angel comes and instructs. He says, Herod is dead. And then in verse 20, everything is the same of when he went to Egypt, but mirrored. He gives the same command and tells him to come back. And really, I wonder how Joseph must have felt again. Like he just spent all this time getting down to Egypt, and he's there for a couple months. Herod dies, and the angel shows up, and he's like, I just sat down. It's like when you get all your snacks to watch a football game or a movie, and you've got your chips and your soda, and you sit down, and then one of your kids or your spouse says, hey, can you do this for me? And you're like, I'd really rather not, okay? I can only imagine how Joseph felt here, and yet he obeys. He moves his family. In verse 21, it says, he arose, took the young child and his mother, and came to the land of Israel. Verse 22, when he heard that Archelaus did reign in Judea in the room of his father, he was afraid. So he changed as God's plan was unfolded. It says he was afraid to go thither. Notwithstanding, being warned of God in a dream, he turned into the parts of Galilee. So he heads to Judea to go back to Bethlehem. This bad guy is the king, and so he says, okay, well, what do I do? He's afraid. I love that it says he's afraid, but not that he wasn't going to go. It makes me think he was afraid and was going to just continue on despite his fear. He continues even as he faces this fear and this another change in his life. And then this also fulfills prophecy in 23. He came and dwelt in Nazareth that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophets. He shall be called a Nazarene. Now, this prophecy is the most interesting of all of them because notice what it says. It says that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of by the prophets. There's not one particular prophet that he's drawing from here. But then also, the quotation is not found anywhere in the Old Testament. There is nothing in the Old Testament that says Jesus would be a Nazarene. So what's this mean? How does this fulfillment work? Well, Nazareth was a small, hated city. You might remember when one of Jesus' disciples heard that he was from Nazareth, he's like, can anything good come from Nazareth? Okay. For us, it might be like, can anything good come from Newark or something like that? Like, who cares about that place? Can anything good come from there? Okay. And so sorry, I got distracted. So he was like, he's from Nazareth. Nazareth was not a liked place. Bethlehem, on the other hand, was a pretty important place. If Jesus had been Jesus of Bethlehem instead of Jesus of Nazareth, he would have received a lot more appreciation and attention. And so there are also multiple prophets that talk about the Messiah, though he was king, as humbled and rejected. Psalm 22:6 says, I am a worm and no man, reproach of men. Isaiah 53:3 says, he is despised, rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. Daniel 9:26, after 62 weeks, the Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. So here's the connection here. The Old Testament is the pattern that the Messiah would be looked down upon by those around him. Jesus was lived in Nazareth, a place where people naturally look down on people. So Joseph dropped everything to obey God and serve Jesus, moving wherever he was told to move, doing what he was ever told to do. I think this shows that Jesus receives the service a king receives. Joseph went where he was told to go. Joseph did what he was told to do. Joseph changed what he was told to change. He served the same way a servant waits on a king. It's one thing to serve someone who doesn't deserve it. It's another thing to serve someone who totally does. And in fact, a lot of times when someone who doesn't deserve our service asks us to do something, we react in a weird way. Let's say you're sitting in the living room, some random kid walks in and says, hey, can you give me a glass of milk, some cookies, and a foot massage? And you look at that kid like, excuse me? Who are you? You kick him out of the house. Like, what are you doing in here? I don't answer to you, okay? But your kid comes in, maybe not the foot massage, but they come in and say, hey, Dad, can I get some milk? Could I get a snack? Could we watch Paw Patrol together and snuggle on the couch? You stand up and you're like, yeah, sure, whatever you want. You go get the milk, you get the snack, you get the blanket, you put Paw Patrol on the TV, and you hang out because that person is important to you. You're happy and willing to serve them. Joseph's service shows that Jesus is the king, willing, deserving of the service that a king gets. He gets the service that a king deserves. Are you willing to do what serving Jesus requires you to do? Are you willing to go where he tells you to go? Maybe he's telling you to go witness to somebody who you think is going to be hostile. Maybe he's calling you to serve him in ministry more, to be more obedient to his plans for your life. Are you willing to change where he tells you to change? Are you willing to do what he tells you to do? Jesus, the King, deserves our ultimate service. So, what's this tell us about Jesus then? Really, the point of this is to show us that Jesus is a king. Jesus is the true King of Israel. He is worshipped by the unlikely, rejected by human authority, and served as a king. He is and needs to be the king of our lives and served as the majesty that he is. So what does this do to our little kingdoms? What does this do to our personal little bubbles that we build for ourselves where we can crown ourselves king and serve in the way that we want to serve? I think that the way that I want you to think about it is before kids and after kids. If you have kids or if you've been around kids, you know that your life drastically changes. Before kids, you can kind of do whatever you want. Right? You and your spouse could wake up in the morning and say, I want to go on a road trip to Florida. Well, you could pack your bags. If you didn't have work, you could throw them in the back of the vehicle and drive to Florida for all you cared. No biggie. Before kids, you could go to bed at any time you wanted. You could invite people over and not have a single care in the world on when you would go to sleep and how long you would talk, and it was no problem. Before kids, you could leave things undone around the house because no one's going to get into it. It's just me around here. No biggie. No troubles, right? But after kids, you want to go somewhere, you got to pack a suitcase full of books and diapers and wipes and a change of clothes and an extra change of clothes in case the change of clothes gets thrown up on, and an extra change of clothes in case that pair of clothes gets thrown up on, okay, in case there's a mess. After kids, you have to invite your friends over, but tell them you will leave my house at 6:30 because my child will be in bed at 7. After kids, you have to start fixing everything all the time because they just find a way to touch things they're not supposed to touch. Your life, all of a sudden, having kids, everything, they become the center of your universe. Everything kind of revolves around them. You can't just leave them to the side and do what you want. That'd make you a bad parent, right? If you just said, hey, you guys just go do over that, and I'm going to do me, you do you, it's all going to work out, that would not make you a good parent. In a way, they become the center of your universe. I think the problem with us then and Jesus as king is that we often just try to leave him and what he says to the side of our little kingdoms. We often just say, I know I'm supposed to worship him wholeheartedly, but since I'm the king of my own little kingdom, I think he understands that I have different priorities. Or we say, I know I'm supposed to receive what he says and obey, but since I'm the king of my little kingdom, I think he understands that I'm going to reject him because I have these other plans for my life. Or we say, I know I'm supposed to serve him at a high cost to me, but since I'm the king of my little kingdom, I'm surely he'll understand that I have other purposes. What does the majesty of this Messiah do to our little kingdoms? What should it do? I believe understanding the majesty of the Messiah should lead us to step off of our thrones and put him at the center of our little kingdoms. We need to step off of our little thrones take our crowns off and put him as the center of our kingdoms and our lives.